It is 10 p.m. Central African Time, coming to you live from the SABC Centre in Johannesburg. This is The Globe on SABC News. I'm Simpio Ngong. Good evening.
A very good evening to you and thank you for joining us. I'm Lulu Gabu. On to our top story. United States President Donald Trump has called on the country to condemn racism, bigotry and white supremacy in his most extensive remarks since mass shootings in Texas and Ohio claimed at least 30 lives over the weekend.
After these latest incidents that are part of a broader violent gun epidemic in the country, Democrats have slammed the president's divisive rhetoric aimed particularly at the immigrants and people of color as emboldening the acts of white supremacists. Trump, striking at times a conciliatory tone, called for bipartisan solutions to gun violence and communities, and El Paso, Texas, Dayton, Ohio mourned the dead.
The front page of the New York Times, a bewildered nation shaken to its core. The Washington Post, 2 cities, 13 hours, 29 dead, before that number rising to 30. A moment of silence at the New York Stock Exchange, with vigils held overnight showcasing a mixture of sadness, hurt and anger after a lone gunman in Dayton, Ohio killed 9 people at a popular drinking spot, including his sister. The suspect, who killed 21 people at a Walmart in El Paso, injuring 26, is being treated as a domestic terrorist after writing a hate-filled manifesto railing against immigrants and a Hispanic invasion.
The shooter in El Paso posted a manifesto online consumed by racist hate. In one voice, our nation must condemn racism, bigotry, and white supremacy. These sinister ideologies must be defeated. Hate has no place in America. Hatred warps the mind, ravages the heart, and devours the soul. We have asked the FBI to identify all further resources they need to investigate and disrupt hate crimes and domestic terrorism.
Trump warned that the internet had provided a dangerous avenue to radicalize disturbed minds, while pointing to the glorification of violence through video games as part of the problem.
Open wounds cannot heal if we are divided. We must seek real bipartisan solutions. We have to do that in a bipartisan manner that will truly make America safer and better for all. First, we must do a better job of identifying and acting on early warning signs. I am directing the Department of Justice to work in partnership with local, state, and federal agencies, as well as social media companies, to develop tools that can detect mass shooters before they strike.
The chair lays before the House.
The Democratic-led House of Representatives in February passed legislation that would make it mandatory for universal background checks, but its progress has been blocked by the Republican leadership in the Senate. The president also hasn't escaped criticism.
You see a president who, in his first speech as a candidate for the highest office in the land, described Mexican immigrants as rapists and criminals, has been warning about the threats of caravans and asylum seekers who he's described as animals and an infestation, despite the fact that immigrants commit crimes at a far lower rate than do those who are born in this country, despite the fact that we are now in one of the safest cities in the United States of America. Safe, not despite, but because it is a city of immigrants. The president's language, his rhetoric, has produced the kinds of hate crimes that we saw in El Paso yesterday, but we've been seeing across this country. They've been on the rise for each one of the last 3 years.
As a politically divided nation grapples with how to move forward in the midst of yet another gun tragedy. The El Paso and Dayton massacres have taken this country to 251 mass shootings this year alone, and it's only August. There are at least 4 other mass shootings this weekend, with fewer dead, that are receiving less national media attention in the wake of the devastation in Texas and Ohio. And while the president has called for bipartisan legislation, the issue of gun control is politically divisive. It's also worth noting that in 2017, President Trump signed a bill rescinding a rule introduced by former President Barack Obama that made it harder for people with mental illnesses to buy a gun. Sherwin Bryce-Pease, SABC News, New York.
Our correspondent, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, joins us live from New York. Sherwin, good evening and thank you so much for joining us on the Globe. Now, over 250 mass shootings in the United States this year alone. Does the carnage we are seeing in El Paso and Ohio take us any closer to a solution to this epidemic?
Yeah, it's a great question, Lulu. I imagine that a majority of Americans, certainly who believe in gun control, reasonable gun control legislation, possibly even the ban on the weapons of war that are being used in these attacks, certainly would like to see lawmakers come together. The president himself talking about bipartisan legislation. I will also point to the fact that Bill Clinton, who was president in the mid-90s, in 1994, signed legislation that banned the use of assault weapons, the type of weapons used in these attacks, for a 10-year period. It was up to the Republican administration of George Bush in the 2004 to renew and extend this legislation, but they chose not to. So that legislation then lapsed. Of course, as a segue to this discussion, it's also good for our viewers to note that just today, this afternoon, a short time ago, in the New York federal court, Cesar Sayoc, the man arrested and convicted of sending 16 bomb-like devices to various critics of the incumbent President Donald Trump, he has now been sentenced to 20 years in prison for those acts. So the president, as we said in that piece, striking a conciliatory tone. It remains to be seen whether lawmakers can emulate the desire of a majority of Americans. Over 90% of Americans in this country want to see reasonable gun control legislation enacted, but this is a political issue, and that is been created by the very powerful lobby group, the National Rifle Association. These are people that rate members of Congress in terms of their appreciation and support for guns. So they are a very powerful lobby group that Republican lawmakers certainly to a large extent have struggled to overcome.
Now, Sherwin, of the 22 people killed in El Paso, a number of Mexicans were either killed or injured. It would appear from preliminary findings in the investigation that immigrants were specifically targeted. What do you know?
Well, the perpetrator in this act that remains under arrest and is speaking to law enforcement, we understand the FBI is now leading this investigation on the ground. He drove for 8 hours from Dallas, Texas, in the same state, to this specific town of El Paso. El Paso is right on the Mexican border, across the border from a town called Juarez in Mexico. And so what you have is a lot of cross-border trade, a lot of cross-border activity between these communities, Americans crossing the border into Mexico, Mexicans crossing the border into the United States. Many families live on either side of the border. So this is a very multicultural town that has managed to integrate in a very good way. Congressman Beto O'Rourke, who is currently running for the Democratic nomination, is the former congressman from this town. And part of his pitch to Americans is about the unity that they experience, the low crime rate that they experience in this town. So this perpetrator, the shooter, driving 8 hours to target what is essentially one of the most integrated cities in this town and having in this country, and having written, we understand, a memorandum of intent, essentially talking about the invasion of Hispanics, the invasion in this country of other people from across the border, and very much in that sense, Lulu, emulating the rhetoric we've heard from no other person than the President of the United States. This prompted the Mexican president and various officials here at the United Nations in New York to also weigh in. Let's watch that.
La venta indiscriminada de armas.
The U.S. needs to control the indiscriminate sale of weapons. I say this with all due respect.
No es nuestro ánimo.
It is not our intention to meddle in the internal matters of any country.
De ningún país.
But yes, the matter should be reviewed because it has an effect on many. And in this case, it affects U.S. citizens and it also affects us.
Replantearse.
The Secretary General condemns in the strongest terms the terrorist attack in El Paso, Texas on August 3rd. He also expresses his shock and outrage over the mass shooting only hours later that took place in Dayton, Ohio. The Secretary General extends his heartfelt condolences to the families and loved ones of the victims and expresses his solidarity with the peoples and governments of the United States and of Mexico, from where a number of those killed and injured in El Paso attack hailed. The Secretary General stresses the need for all to work together to counter violence rooted in hatred, racism, xenophobia, and all forms of discrimination.
Ms. Maria Fernanda Espinosa expressed shock to hear the news about both shootings, which happened within 24 hours. The PJ said that it was terribly disturbing to learn that hate speech might have been the motive for one of the attacks.
And of course, very important also to note that in those remarks at the White House by President Trump earlier, Lulu, he said he would be instructing his Justice Department to formulate legislation that made these hate crimes punishable by the death penalty. Of course, that runs counter to United Nations policy, or certainly progressive countries with progressive constitutions around the world, like South Africa, where the death penalty is not policy of the UN and not policy of many progressive countries around the world.
Sherwin, do we know what the motive might have been for the shooting in Dayton, Ohio? From reporting, we understand that the shooter also killed his sister when he turned the gun on evening revelers at a popular night spot before he was taken down by police.
Yeah, a lot of people scratching their heads about this one. This was, people out at 1 a.m. On Saturday night, early Sunday morning, in a very popular Dayton, Ohio nightclub area. There were bars. They were probably having consumed alcohol and suddenly started hearing gunshots. So law enforcement really trying to still piece those pieces together. We understand the shooter was wearing body armor. He had an assault rifle and was able to kill 9 people, Lulu, and injure about 24 within the space of 30 seconds. Police were right there around the corner when those gunshots rang out at 1 a.m. in the morning and were able to respond within 30 seconds. But within that period of time, and this is part of the conversation that analysts and lawmakers are having right now, is the extent to which within that short period of time, these assault rifles can kill 9 people and injure almost 30. And so that really is a conversation that is going to be part of the bipartisan legislation, possibly, that President Trump was referring to, in terms of how we limit, or how this country limits, access to the types of weapons that are used in theaters of war. Within 30 seconds, 9 people killed and almost 30 injured. That should be something that people are really talking about and thinking about today.
Now, while President Trump struck a conciliatory tone in his prepared remarks today, he also shifted blame to the media in earlier tweets today. What exactly did he say?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Of course, the president was quite contrite in his remarks, sticking, we call it teleprompted Trump, in terms of him sticking to the message. But what we've seen in previous iterations of these kinds of tragedies in the United States is that the president will say something that has been written for him. He will read it. He will stick to that message. And then within hours or later that day, there will be a flurry of tweets reverting to his old positions. The president this morning tweeting that the media has a big responsibility to life and safety in the country. Fake news has contributed greatly to anger and rage that has built up over many years. News coverage has got to start being fair, balanced, and unbiased, or these terrible problems will get worse. So the president already pivoting to his old position of blaming the media for some of the problems that this country is facing, but as in true Trump style, not really taking any self-reflection, some introspection, and looking at perhaps what his role has been in creating the divides we see in the country today. I will just reference a rally that he held a couple of weeks ago in the Panhandle, sort of northern Florida. He was there speaking to his base, and at one point he was talking about the invasion of immigrants and people coming into the country, and a person in the audience shouted, "Shoot them." The president smiled. It created a moment of levity in that audience. They laughed, and the president, quote, said, you can only get away with saying that in the Panhandle, but not really shutting that person down who screamed those words, "Shoot them," when the so-called invasion happens. And we saw someone take up that role and shoot a lot of people in El Paso this past weekend.
Sherwin, thank you so much for joining us. We'll leave it there for now. That is our New York correspondent, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, joining us there via Skype.